If I was Putin, I would worry about the warming relationships between India and China.
It's certainly sunset time for Narendra Modi. So he's certainly on his way out. He's not going tomorrow, but he's not here for long. Operating in China is much easier than operating in India.
Thanks to you, I'm widening that network in India. I can see the corruption. I can see the contradiction of the Indian states that don't work as provinces within a unity. Historically, India has traded with the world. When we talk about the history of up until 1820, the two great economies were the Indian and the Chinese. It's kind of false because China wasn't trading with the rest of the world.
The Indian economy has seen manufacturing slip from 17% to 13%. So the Indian government has not been very good at encouraging manufacturing. In fact, under Narendra Modi, they have wiped out their small and medium-sized businesses.
But for India, if I was in Delhi, I would say, let's use China as the catalyst for change in India.
Welcome to FO Talks. With me is David Mahon. He is an investor in Beijing. He has just come back from Nepal and India. He is an accomplished thinker. He understands geopolitics, economics, and business. That's a rare combination. And today, together, we will make sense of China-India economic relations. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Atul.
David, let's get cracking with the very first thing on my mind. And the very first thing on my mind is perhaps because of my family's military background, my own background as an officer, related to the China-India border dispute, their geopolitical tensions. And the question is simple: can China and India dehyphenate trade and economic relations from their border dispute and geopolitical tensions?
They can. I think if you look at Modi's presence at the Shanghai meeting or the Tianjin meeting of the Shanghai Organization in last year.
The SCO, right? The Shanghai Community Organization.
Correct. That shows the pragmatism of India and China. It was Xi Jinping's invitation. But Modi came not in any form of tribute. He came very much from the perception, looking at him in the media, and from the feedback I have had on the Chinese side, from a position of strength, which means that it is possible. And there have been many periods when on those disputed lines, there has been great restraint on the part of both armies. So my fear is that on the Chinese side, in the past, this has been utilized for domestic consumption. It's a way of showing a sort of dumb show of strength. And I say that because to have any military conflict there at this point for either side is actually pointless. We both know that there are means for both Delhi and Beijing to swap land, to negotiate. This was something that was in play before the 1962 war. So,
Zhou Enlai's proposal was arguably the most sensible proposal that could have brought peace to both countries. But Jawaharlal Nehru, who had acquiesced in the takeover of Tibet for some reason, couldn't go along with the Zhou Enlai proposal. And you've read my long piece, my 30,000 plus word piece, which I've written with retired CIA officer Glenn Carl and the former RAW chief Vikram Sood. So you know where I stand on that issue. I think it's a pity that proposal didn't come to pass over 60 years ago.
It is a pity. The invasion on the Chinese side was unfortunate. Of course, under the sort of veil of the missile crisis, with both Russia and America very much
In Cuba,
preoccupied with
the
Cuba.
Cuban Missile Crisis gave the Chinese the opportunity, and they struck.
Yeah. So I think if you, to answer your question directly, the answer is yes. And when it comes to these things, to what extent is conflict and history definitive? I look at the end of the Second World War and how Western powers very quickly made friends with Japan and Germany and traded with them, and it contributed to economic miracles to occur in both countries because of the Cold War and because of market demand and businesses and what they wanted and their pressure on politics. So we can be avowed enemies of each other because of the conflict and as quickly become friends in this forgetful geopolitical life we all lead. So I think from a point of view of looking at what are the needs of both countries, they need not to be in conflict now. They need that for a number of purposes, not the least of which being America's stance towards both the Indian and the Chinese economy and the bullying of those economies and the benefit they would both derive from being more united. Now, there's tremendous complexities in how China would interact with India and how India would set the rules of engagement in a more comprehensive economic relationship. But fundamentally, the answer is yes, and it is deeply in the interest of both countries to do so.
So let me push back a little bit. The Chinese do not like the fact that India gave refuge to the Dalai Lama. That continues to be a sore. The Indians are petrified by the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC. And in the recent India-Pakistan border tussle, Chinese weapons were used by Pakistan. Some would argue to deadly effect. So it isn't post-war Europe, my good sir, when the different European powers had realized the folly of continuing military conflict. They said, let's just trade and let's just prosper, and we'll have a welfare state as well in the process. India and China at the moment have unresolved business, and that unresolved business might come in the way of real business. What do you say to that?
A direct parallel with the West after the Second World War, as you identified, is not a full metaphor. It doesn't really work. But it works in principle, in that when your interests, your separate but shared interests, in the case of India and China, overcome the chagrin, the distrust, and apart from the border itself, and there are ways of dealing with that as we've identified, there's a direct relationship with the fact that Pakistan as a partner for China is a very, very difficult partner. It's one in which China has invested huge amounts of money. The result has been far less than people assess. If you look at the top line figures, I think even if the IMF carry these figures of some $65 billion invested in Belt and Road projects, when it's less than 30, because most of them have not been that successful. Yes, they have managed to build a road across there.
Spectacular feat of engineering, but hardly any trade goes through there.
It's too dangerous because the domestic political circumstances in Pakistan, which means that so much of northern Pakistan is actually not in the control of Islamabad at all. And one would argue they operate as almost separate principalities. So China's not really benefiting from the economic corridor that was supposed to be. Gwadar port is useful, but China has many ports around the world now where, for its the maritime side of Belt and Road, they are facilitated. So China, yes, China has a relationship with Pakistan, but I don't believe that this is one that defines China's sense of its strategic positioning in the region. China has a much much deeper, much broader need and mandate. And India is part of that, because India brings in the the Indian Ocean, where Chinese naval presence is now constant. That's an issue for India, and China doesn't want to clash. So, as we were discussing before this podcast began, there's an uncommonly good relationship between the military leaders in India and key figures and the Chinese. A lot of dialogue, a lot of communication. But the other is Myanmar, where the instability in Myanmar, the inability of China to have any influence there, is a major issue. And that's an issue for both India and China, because neither can control a fragmented country that's in such deep conflict. People think of it as one country, and as you and I know, it's a concoction that was forged under the Raj for English purposes, when in fact it's different cultures, different languages, to some extent different religions. So that is
Myanmar
a country
is
which...
imploding. Any astute observer of Myanmar knows that the country has actually imploded already. The writ of the Myanmarese state doesn't run in vast tracts of land. And what happens next is anyone's guess.
That's correct. And China has, on the border, and I've been there twice in the last 12 months on the Chinese border with Myanmar. And it's very clear that they are trying to prevent any of this chaos and criminality from seeping into the state of Yunnan. There's no question in their minds that they have no illusions. They have no leverage. They have no agency there. They just try and manage it so it doesn't damage their own neighboring provinces. So these are things which, if India and China think through the problem that America is creating for all of us and how their unity could resolve from a commercial and economic point of view some of those issues, I think those motives are enough. And last year in Beijing was an expression of the beginning of something which could be significant. Nonetheless, the impediments are considerable. They're not so much in the history of conflict and distrust. They lie actually in the economies of both countries and how they would relate in a practical sense, how businesses would interact, what regulation is like in India and what regulation is like in China. These are the potential contradictions.
So let me, you mentioned that China is much more than Pakistan. Let me raise one more point on the geopolitical front and we'll move on. And that point is the string of pearls strategy. A lot of Indians, military men included, are worried about being encircled in their own neighborhood. China is close to Bangladesh. China has been training Bangladeshi Navy and indeed the military. China has a foothold in Hambantota in Sri Lanka. China is now quite close to Maldives. China is now on the ascendant in Nepal. More Chinese vehicles and two-wheelers apparently are there in Nepal than Indian ones. Big reversion. And even Bhutan, where the king and I were together at Oxford, and I have since lost touch, so I can't claim any special access. But even Bhutan, from what I learned, from what I gather, is trying to balance both India and China. And so if you are India, sitting in Delhi and observing Chinese influence in Myanmar or in Bangladesh or in Sri Lanka or in Maldives, leave aside Pakistan, you are very likely to be nervous.
You are, and India, one must have an acceptance that there is good cause for that discomfort on the part of India. I was, as you noted, in Nepal very recently, just before Christmas.
Yes, I mentioned that.
My interest was there was an uprising which, to all intents and purposes, seemed spontaneous, and many of these uprisings actually was rooted deeply in the economic disparity that exists there, the corruption, the government, a despair amongst young people, relatively well-educated young people. I was very curious, was this something that China had a hand in, or did India have a hand in it? And the impression I got, not just in Kathmandu, but also in Delhi, was that no, India wasn't involved. And actually their view was nor was China. This was more to do with a spontaneous uprising of some force. But then there had been preparation. And the mention was that perhaps it was political forces related to Bangladesh, and it was also related to the CIA. Their evidence was how well organized the demonstrations became very swiftly, and the preparation that things like certain bombs in ministerial offices, government offices around Kathmandu, which were alluded to by the protesters, that if they didn't get their way, they would be set off. This kind of thing is not something you pull together as a bunch of angry students. So, like a lot of these things, there is a coercion, or something like this gets owned or taken over to some extent by outside forces. But it wasn't China. And my own understanding in Beijing was that they were very surprised when it happened. And of course, they have a lot of resources in Nepal. So we overestimate China's political agency. And we often underestimate the practical, transactional nature of a lot of the relationships we have been referring to. So I think the danger to India of these relationships that you've identified are far less than India thinks. And even if, and one should look at them from an Indian perspective as potentially a problem, then deal with China. Not dealing with China only makes these things worse, because the isolation, the separation of the two countries, the lack of interaction amongst officials, means that instead of information, programs, commercial initiatives, you have fears, conspiracies. They go to the vacuum that those things, the absence of those leave. So one way or the other, distrust or trust, the best way is deal with China, and for China to deal with India.
All right. So let's talk about economics. India and China have a fair bit of trade. India has a $100 billion deficit. Correct me if I'm wrong, something to that effect with China. China, before 2020, before the Galwan clash, was investing a fair bit in the Indian market. Of course, India thereafter curbed Chinese investment, kicked out a lot of Chinese apps. But before 2020, the economic ties between India and China were deepening regularly. And even now, for all its efforts to reduce supply chain dependence on China, India still has a growing trade deficit. So paint us a picture as to what does China export to India, and what does India export to China, and why is the relationship between the two countries so important for each other?
Well, essentially, of course, many manufactured goods, industrial goods, flow from China into India, and the trade deficit is only nearly every trade partner with China finds it runs a trade deficit, because China is an immensely productive country. China is the world's manufacturing hub. So it's not a weakness
of the world today.
It is. So I think the imbalance is that there's a lack of value-added exports from India, and there's a lack of focus within India around what can be supported to strengthen a relationship with China in a way that strengthens India. And if I was an Indian policymaker, I would look at what does China have that I need in my country, and follow the long-standing traditions that India has utilized in dealing with foreign industrial interests, which is require that there are joint ventures. So there are transfers of technology. China manufactures many things within India itself. But I would say this for the electric vehicle sector, which would certainly go a long way to help resolve a lot of the pollution issues in Indian cities.
Mhm.
And this is something that in some free trade agreement you can mandate. The Chinese did it in the early stages.
Let me stop you there. I mean, what you are saying really is that China has manufacturing muscle, and China therefore is able to export a lot of stuff that India needs. And we can talk about cell phones, laptops, solar panels, or solar photovoltaic cells. We can talk about industrial machinery. We can talk about electric cars, although there's a very high duty. We don't see as many BYDs in China as we would otherwise with the duties lower. APIs for the pharmaceutical industry. Apparently, a huge percentage, a whopping percentage. So the reality is that at the moment, it is China that's supplying India's needs. And my question to you is that, is there Chinese demand? We know that demand is depressed in China. Real estate, we've talked about it in our last interview. Real estate has gone down and consumption is not terribly high. Is there even a possibility for India to export much to China?
At the moment, not a great deal because of the competitiveness of Chinese-owned industries within their own domestic market. But if you look at the data from last year, where over 40% of cell phones imported into the US came from India, because Apple has, of course, built Apple. So I should say Apple smartphones.
Yeah.
So in a time when, even though China is going to find...
A lot of the components come from China. So yes,
that's true.
The phones are made in India, but the components for those phones are largely coming from China. The supply chain of India is still, like pharmaceuticals, for instance. India exports a lot to the US, but the ingredients, the APIs for those pharmaceuticals come from China.
And that is a level of dependence that India needs to acknowledge. It's a reality. But we can't talk in absolute terms of winning and losing.
Yeah.
We need to talk in terms of incremental development, where as much as India can be now more open to domestic investment in India itself and for Chinese industries, and I would ask BYD to build factories in India. That means you are having the transfer of technology, you're increasing employment in India, you are building skill bases around the various engineering disciplines that go with making electric vehicles. But where there is a global issue with China amongst many Western countries, and in this fragmented, scattered multipolar world, there are a lot of countries that want to hedge their bets. India is their second choice, or the hedge they're seeking. So as much as China interacts with India, it can begin in many areas to be an alternative in some of those industries. So it cooperates with China, but by doing so learns to compete in some areas with China, which is a very rational and fair way of going about things in a free market economy. So China can't get too upset about that.
Yeah.
So I think, it's a matter of...
But the catch is that the Indian government, and you've heard my previous podcast on the Indian economy, the Indian economy has seen manufacturing slip from 17% to 13%. So the Indian government has not been very good at encouraging manufacturing. In fact, under Narendra Modi, they have wiped out their small and medium-sized businesses. I don't think that was the intention. But I think that has been the consequence of poorly thought through policies and excruciatingly awful implementation. And India has not tackled its colonial era bureaucracy. So given that fact, I know a very good friend of mine who has said on the record, and he makes oil drum caps. He said on the record that operating in China is much easier than operating in India because if there's a regulation and the permission does not come in a certain amount of time, it's deemed given. Whilst in India, you're just waiting for the file forever. So, given that reality, it's almost saying, well, India needs to do this, but imagine you have someone weak and on a bad diet, and they don't have the capacity to do any of the things you're saying. And let's get to China. China is producing more than its domestic market can consume. One hears recent reports that consumption has plummeted thanks to a real estate bust. Yes, you've said it's more nuanced. But what we do hear is shopping malls are going empty. Factories have overcapacity. So have we reached a point where China needs an export-oriented economy? It's no longer a choice, but a necessity. And India, which is incapable of manufacturing anything for the reasons I outlined earlier, has no choice but to import from China for goods, though not services, that would otherwise be unaffordable to millions.
Well, to first take the Chinese economy, consumption has slowed and has been somewhat stagnant. The property market was a major correction triggered by the government. And also, if you now look at the general market in China and the key areas, I'm currently in Shanghai today. Shanghai is in the Huadong area, which is the southeast corner of China, which is 2% of global GDP, 7% of China's. This is a place of tremendous dynamism. Its consumption is less than it was pre-COVID, but it's not dead. It grew. It's arguable. We're just beginning to get the data from last year, but it's between 3 to 4% growth last year. You've got, yes, there are empty shopping malls in some places, although, the major ones in Shanghai are seething. Actually, my hotel is part of one. I'm staying in a hotel close to the client I'm servicing here. But the actual retail growth is considerable. I think it's close to 6% if you take those key 11 coastal provinces, even higher if you come into the cities like these, because it's moved online. It's more efficient. It's easier for people to consume. In Beijing, there are many empty shopping malls where the planning wasn't so sensible, and a lot of it was you build them all because there is corruption related to such large, complex real estate projects, and the commercial outcome is not always the first motive of the developer, and they're paying the price. But retail is also online, and people are just buying direct to their household. So the argument that China's in some great slump, and it's not the case. The argument that China's trade account is the key to its economy has not been true for over 12 years. It is a myth. It's an IMF myth. It's not a myth of the World Bank. The World Bank gets this a lot more, they assess it more correctly. It's been very helpful that we've had export growth in the last 2 years because of what it's done for employment. But there are still 25 million employment jobs in manufacturing empty. They're filling slowly, and that will accelerate as younger people realize that they have to step down if they're going to work because their qualifications don't actually meet the demands of the job market. So there are many things within the Chinese economy that are imbalanced, but these things are not fundamental to the concept that China is growing at 5%, and 5% in an economy of the size and scale and complexity of China is absolutely huge. It's close to a developing country now in many of the indicators. So the issue is that, yes, there are these issues within India, and I don't have the depth that you have. As you know, I travel to India when I can. I think my last trip was my 15th. I I don't go as a tourist per se. I try and have as grassroots an experience as possible. I try and meet people in business and meet people who are decision makers. And thanks to you, I'm widening that network in India. I can see the corruption. I can see the contradiction of the Indian states that don't work as provinces within a unity. They compete in a negative sense with each other. They marginalize each other's interests through the competition. I also see this, is it the Nehruvian socialism of the past, that there's a command economic mindset in Delhi. And a lot of the ideas are not very smart. You mentioned the wiping out of SMEs in manufacturing, which was I'm sure an unintended consequence, but a consequence nonetheless.
And it was thanks to demonetization, which suddenly withdrew currency notes, and therefore there was no cash for small businesses to operate, and they were operating on small margins. And then they rolled out the goods and sales tax in the middle of a financial year, which again, for me, is just madness. It's not just one pistol, it's two pistols to your head.
So I look at a parallel, and that is, and as you know, I went to China in 1984 and have been living there since. And I went to a country where 90% of the people lived in the countryside. Everyone was universally poor. And my introduction to China was, I joined number 2 construction company in Beijing, which was building the Great Wall Hotel, the first steel-framed curtain wall high-rise building in China. So I worked with Chinese workers for 6 months. That was my entree. In fact, embassies turned their noses up, including my own, when I turned up, and they realized what I was doing. I was a worker with dust on his shoes, boots. And so I saw a China that was poor. I saw a China that was insolvent, if you looked at it from a macroeconomic perspective. Mm-hmm. A number of things were undertaken, and we don't need to go to the history of Deng Xiaoping's reforms. I think your listeners will be well aware of those. We do need to go, though, to the tenure of Zhu Rongji, who I think if you take two great forces for change in China, the parents of those forces are Deng Xiaoping and Zhu Rongji, who was the premier under Jiang Zemin, the then president. Zhu Rongji was the architect of China re-entering the WTO. Yeah. I'm proud to say New Zealand.
Give the viewers a bit of color about his background. He's the man who built modern Shanghai. He was mayor of Shanghai. He was a truly remarkable leader.
Extraordinary man. He was a man with great economic insight. He certainly understood business, and he understood the what was required in terms of application of Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms. And that's something that I would argue very few people after him, until possibly I'm being careful here because my knowledge isn't comprehensive to answer or to go here. But if you look at the move to the market economy, what he did by bringing in international business through WTO was bring tools for change in his own economy that they couldn't generate within the economy on their own. And so, very interestingly, they reached internationally for something that brought competition, that drove a need for regulation, for the development of commercial law, things that barely existed in any useful form when the reforms were initiated in the 70s and 80s. So, and of course, if you mentioned the background of Zhu Rongji, if you are able to run a city of nearly 30 million people, being Shanghai, it does qualify you for Beijing. It's the place where it's the testing ground. The one thing I do recall profoundly was that during the Tiananmen Square and June 6th uprising, which was 12 cities of China, not just Beijing. Beijing was where all the journalists were.
You're speaking about 1989.
1989. Mm-hmm. There was the crackdown in Beijing, and Zhu Rongji, its party secretary of Shanghai, was told, you now need to crack down in Shanghai. This has to stop. He said, I want 24 hours. And the Nanjing Armored Division was outside of Shanghai. The Marines had gradually built up their presence along the Huangpu River. So they would have moved the military very swiftly into Shanghai. But he made the comment, Shanghai's not Beijing. In those days, it was a colonial labyrinth. It wasn't easy to move through the city. He said, give me 24 hours and I will end this. And he mobilized every teacher, every doctor, every nurse, the local police to go into the streets and talk to the students and protesters and say, you know what's happened in Beijing? We're not going to have this happen in Shanghai. And they talked them home. It's an amazing act of peacemaking on his part. If he'd failed, we would have never have heard of him again. The failure would have been too great. His political career would have finished.
Spectacular what he achieved.
So I met him once, or I was present in a group of people that met him. It was amongst fund managers and bankers, and it was actually in Sydney. And a deeply impressive man, intellectually, even his physical presence. He was physically relaxed and graceful when he walked. He wasn't a man of anxiety and tension. There was nothing impetuous about him. But bringing in the WTO forces to the Chinese economy helped modernize it like almost no other single act that China, they promulgated a lot of good policy, but the full application was an issue. My point being, for India, nothing should be done swiftly. Any relationship and rapprochement with China when related to commercial relationships should be done gradually. But for India, if I was in Delhi, I would say, let's use China as the catalyst for change in India so we can improve our own industrial environment, industrial sectors. We can bring the kind of pressures to bear on businesses that they can compete. And we as regulators, we as bureaucrats will be forced to change the mess. You refer to it as the Raj bureaucracy, which I think
the Indian Administrative Service sits at the top. They are the crown jewel. They are the super Brahmins of the Indian state.
Well, again, you don't have to be a resident of India, but a frequent traveller to get that. I see that. And the suffocating bureaucracy and process that's applied. Legal process is one that I always was very critical of the Chinese legal system, but it is a highly functioning system now, whereas the Indian system, despite its deep sort of Westminster parliamentary roots and principles, is a tool of the bureaucracy. It's not a check and balance on the bureaucracy, which a lot of people assume is the case in India. So these are things which...
David, if I may interject, I don't think India ever had the Westminster system. In fact, Harshan Kumarasingham, one of our authors, has come up with this idea of the Eastminster system, which is these countries ruled by viceroys. They never had debate and discussion. They never had the Anglo-Saxon heritage of say, John Stuart Mill writing on liberty. They didn't have philosophies such as utilitarianism floating around. They inherited a colonial structure which concentrated all power in the executive. And once people assumed power, the local elites assumed power, they said, we sort of like it. Let's concentrate power even further. And you're absolutely right. The Indian judicial system, it's not just that it's a handmaiden to the administrative state, or the Babu state, as I call it, but it is delayed, dysfunctional, and fundamentally ineffective. And in fact, part of the reason you have recourse to criminals in certain parts of the country is that the so-called mafia bosses deliver what the courts fail to deliver. And yes, the justice may be roughshod, but at least it is instant justice. Whilst if you end up in an Indian court, you may end up, it's like waiting for Godot. It's not Kafkaesque, in the words of a friend. It is Kafka.
Yeah. And forgive me, the term was incorrect. I didn't mean to refer to the Westminster parliamentary system. The principles of a parliamentary legal system was one that I saw was utilized by the British And I can see, as exactly as you said, that when the Raj left, it was replaced by another of an Indian hierarchy, which has been a major issue since independence. The point is that if change, in the end, politicians do depend on economic growth for social stability. And in a country the size of India, that dependence will be in enough states that if there was a better relationship commercially with China, that relationship and that interaction would strengthen those states. So that's the potential. I'm not underestimating the impediments. And I don't have the information, the knowledge that you have, the experience you have of how the state, how India functions or the dysfunction that is India in many cases. I'm just talking of a principle and drawing a parallel that if you looked at China at the time that Zhurongji made that decision, and New Zealand had nominated China to rejoin the WTO, we also acknowledged China, first country, to do so as a free market economy, which was hugely resisted. We got a lot of flack for that. But it was true. China had become, in many terms, a relative free market. The point is, at that stage, you had a dominance of state-owned industries. There were no such things as banks. There were these policy centers for allocating capital. China was a massively unproductive society from an industrial perspective, immensely backward. The technology, up until the late 90s, in the work we were doing with our private equity funds investing in Chinese businesses, we were investing in the 1950s. The factories, the diesel engine factories, the transformer factory that we invested in, essentially the technology was that backward. So we underestimate, or we forget how backward China was and how poor China was right up until the end of the 90s. So China's problems were then are different than India's problems today. But because of the acknowledgement of the elite then, and when we talk of elites, China's run by an elite. It's run by an elite which is the Chinese Communist Party. There is a difference which I identify, that to be part of that world of government and elite, if you are able, if you study well and you study useful things, it has an extraordinarily meritocratic system, which has been the genius of the evolution of the Chinese government, the Chinese bureaucracy, Chinese officialdom. And there are huge barriers to that within India. So I'm not underestimating the differences.
But the Chinese have proved themselves to be competent, and the Indians have proved themselves to be incompetent as far as their bureaucratic and policymaking apparatus is concerned.
So the point is, I think you need to begin a very long march, forgive a Chinese analogy, in terms of a relationship with India to get a more balanced economic interaction. So India benefits more, which means you've got to lift all these barriers to Chinese investment within India and these other impediments, regulatory impediments, some of the tariffs, and start the process. But you can manage the process. There's no need for India to be overwhelmed by China in putting this into practice.
So, I mean, look, what you're saying is that just as China used, or Zhurongji used, the WTO to infuse capital and technology into China and make it a far more productive economy, and it was highly backward and poor until then. India should use Chinese capital and technology to improve its manufacturing, which has slipped to, say, 13% from 17%, and raise it from 13 to perhaps 20%. That is the crux of your argument. Would that be fair?
That's true, yes.
Okay. All right. So we'll see if the Indians policymakers demonstrate a vision and will for that. Let me ask you a different question. China runs into an American wall each time it tries to deepen relations with India. So what are Beijing's plans to overcome American influence in Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, and elsewhere? After all, the entire Indian upper middle class, not just children of the elite, um, send them over to study in American universities. They do their undergraduate degrees here in the US. And the only place that gives India a trade surplus is America. The dollars that pay for India's exports come from the US. So how does India, embrace China further without disrupting its close and beneficial relationship with the US? Not to mention cultural ties and educational ties.
And those are considerable.
Mm-hmm.
But remember, many more students have gone from China to the United States and continue to go. And if you look at, I think 9 provinces of China have governors with Ivy League degrees.
Mm-hmm.
So that interaction with the great intellectual prowess of the United States is something both countries have benefited from and remain influences on both countries. I think if you consider those people too, those young people, and those mature business people, intellectuals who are Indians and are now in critical roles in the US, these people are not stupid. And they also know what's best for their own country. India has a position, has an ability to do something very few countries can do, which is because of its geopolitical, its geographical situation and its importance, not just to the United States, but its great importance to Russia, its great importance to the region politically. India can work with both countries. And one of the things I was going to add to this catalyst, that WTO-like catalyst that deeper China commercial relationships could bring to India. India is also already the recipient of investment because it's not China, the hedging that's taking place amongst multinational companies. And that's a situation that India needs to also invest in and attract more of that business. So at the same time as opening with China, it's building countervailing forces to make sure that it doesn't need to be so dependent on China as it would if it wasn't building business with other countries, particularly American businesses. The thing also is we think of all of India and all the contradictions, the big blaring. I mean, India, the reason I love going to India is that in India, I have a sense this is us. This is humanity. This is one of the best case studies for humanity, with all its great flaws and its genius. And to me, that is India. So I look at that and I think, yes, but maybe there is a strategy that 1 or 2 states undertake. If Delhi can step back a bit, let 1 or 2 states focus on developing a relationship with China so it's contained in some form. And that's something that China did with its economic zones. I know this is a loose analogy and a difficult one to bring into practical reality, but something along those lines would make sense. So there's a focus as to where Chinese investment goes. Of course, those areas would benefit very much from the presence of Chinese investment. But that's something where India only needs to change some areas of its bureaucracy and its commercial environment. So it's saying, well, Delhi's acknowledging we don't even have the power ourselves to look at our own bureaucracy and change the things that block you, China, coming and fruitfully participating in our economy. So you do it in 1 or 2 states, or perhaps just 1 state. Mm-hmm. So this is an incremental process, not something that's done overnight.
Got it. Now, you said, bringing investment in, but David, you know that FDI in India for the last 2 years has practically been zero. Foreign direct investment simply isn't coming. Foreign institutional investment has also collapsed. Investors have pulled money out of Indian stock markets. So far, domestic investors have propped it up, and that too mainly the use of life insurance and people's salaries going to prop up the stock markets. And the reality is right now, and perhaps this is just a cyclical phase. Perhaps there'll be a crisis and India will reform, as in 1991. But at the moment, India is not getting much foreign investment at all. And my question to you, as someone who deals with business, deals with the global economy, and knows a fair bit about foreign investment, is that where is India going wrong, and what does it need to do to attract investment?
I think India's lack of foreign direct investment is the fact that globally there's a lack of foreign direct investment. China's foreign direct investment is a trickle compared to even pre-COVID. And it's the reticence of global investors as the American empire breaks down dramatically, and how random blocks to global trade are thrown up weekly, personally by Donald Trump. I mean, we're trying to get our heads around the sanctions on anyone dealing with Greenland, which is just, it's absurd. This is, if we imagine, if someone had proposed this as a sort of a futurist novel or a political science fiction or political fiction of the future, it would have been considered too absurd. So India is suffering from that global malaise, and China is also suffering from it. But there are many countries in the world, as China has demonstrated, that if you move beyond the sphere of the United States, if you do what they have done in Africa, if you do what they have done in Brazil, they've managed to maintain a balance of trade in general for their trade account, and they've managed to source the materials. And if we remember, China is not just the source of exports and often flooding markets of its trade partners to the point of imbalance, which does happen. China is hugely dependent on resources, components. As much as you described what, for instance, Apple depends in terms of, or Foxconn in India, depends in buying from China. China buys nearly everything. It needs tungsten, copper, oil. It needs protein. I mean, I look at if you just look at that as the rapprochement with Canada, it's terribly important for China, because China was a massive importer of grain, of beef. China's going to be overjoyed that now it can get back to dealing with a sophisticated, reliable, efficient trade partner. It's very difficult sourcing soya beans from Latin America. It's much easier sourcing soya beans from North America. So India, in that sense, can look at China and say, well, you are an interdependent economy. There is nothing singular about your domestic market. There's nothing hermetic about China, although we like to characterize it like that. India is in a position where it can look at the Chinese example also in terms of the way it's dealing beyond the sphere of the United States. The Indians who we are referring to internationally and your global elite, they can see what's happening, and they will understand, despite the problems in their own home country they know so well, the economic opportunities that this emergence of a multipolar world offers India. And remember, historically, India has traded with the world. When we talk about the history of up until 1820, the two great economies were the Indian and the Chinese, it's kind of false, because China wasn't trading with the rest of the world. China was itself. It was its own domestic dynamic. It wasn't involved with the empires that rose and fell over the centuries that we're referring to before 1820. Whereas India, through all the chaos of its occupation, of its being drawn into the British Empire, being bullied by the East India Company, it was trading with the rest of the world. And that's its history. That's its mercantile history. So we have to remember that even when you are maybe not having a great diet, or the quality of your school teacher in your mountain village is not so good, China was no different than that. And those are issues that India faces. Once you can feed people better, and certainly that's been one thing I we mustn't underestimate the developments in India too, especially over the last 20 years, in infrastructure, the improvement in diet, the improvement in the spread of education and literacy. These are things which, once you get these into some balance, your people do the work. In the end, if I look at the success of China, you've got catalysts like Deng Xiaoping, we referred to Zhurongji. The work was done by the people, their aspirations, their pressure on their government, on their local government, on their local party secretary. It was that moved China into the marketplace. It wasn't some great epiphany that took place within the Chinese Communist Party. There was a gradual mutation to adapt to those forces coming from the country. So we should look at the grassroots forces of India, and that in the end, it's the aspirations and demands of ordinary people that change a government, and have confidence that in the right kind of government that's receptive and can basically get out of the way, those are the forces that will make the difference.
So it's interesting you said a government that can get out of the way, because unfortunately, in the last few years, we have so much tax terrorism, and that's a word you'll find everywhere, from X to meetings with businessmen, where an arbitrary, punitive, and draconian tax notices have destroyed demand in India. Savings are down, they've depleted savings, and private investment is down. And so what we've seen is a government that has got in the way, and progressively in the way, and destroyed that innate Indian genius that you speak about, which saw ships sailing from Portugal to India way back in 1498, and French, Dutch, and British ships coming to Indian shores to trade. And there's a reason why Native Americans were called Indians, because everyone was really looking to get to India. So yes, India has been a trading nation. India has been historically a producer of valuables, which the global economy has coveted. But at the moment, the Indian economy is down in the dumps because the Indian state has got in the way. So given current conditions, my question to you is the deficit just keep going higher and higher, meaning the trade deficit with China, and is India likely, over at least the foreseeable future, going to be a dumping ground almost for Chinese goods?
China is a country where the state is very strong, but it's a country where, when it comes to business, it's private companies that largely are the drivers, and they do what they do. There's no way the state sets a mandate, you go out and acquire this in this country or this culture, or we need these resources. It's just opportunity being seized by individual companies. And so it's difficult to avoid the kind of dumping that you've mentioned, because private companies are opportunistic and they would see great advantages in entering the Indian market.
Let me ask you something that is doing the rounds in India, which is that one hears that China is using informal industrial sanctions against India, just as the US is using formal financial sanctions against India. Is that true? And if that is true, why is Beijing doing so?
I don't know the details of the non-tariff barriers, which, yes, China does apply in certain circumstances. I would assume it's related to the conflict and related to their perception of what took place when we had the military conflict. Also, the fact that India put all these caveats on Chinese commercial endeavors in India. So this is a reciprocal situation. But one of the things that you can look at in a relationship like this is that there are so many things you can improve without changing a huge amount. One of them is, if you've got non-tariff barriers in action, these can be stopped, quite quickly. which makes a huge difference. I remember when various countries got free trade agreements, my own, Australia, you saw the huge uplift in trade, how swiftly things improved at the port. So it's a problem, but it's one of the things, it's one of the tools of how to improve a relationship and a commercial relationship.
Mm-hmm.
The incumbence is on India to make sure it governs growth in a relationship with China, that it avoids dumping, that it creates an environment where it says, this is the vulnerability of our economy. So China, these are the things that you need to abide by going forward. And any country has the right to say that in forming a new commercial relationship. And it's something which India should say to China and make very specific conditions for the improved commercial relationship, because China needs India. China needs it geopolitically. China needs to now bank this rapprochement. It needs to make sure that going forward, it's reading, and I think China has done this in a very thoughtful manner, the deterioration of America's relationship with everybody is going to create potential for improved relationships with China. It doesn't have to do something. It just has to watch America continue to make mistakes. Even the Greenland situation, if I look at China's thinking around that, they're looking at thinking, well, we increased our investment in Greenland substantially. They offered an airport deal, and the Americans told Denmark it can't be done. It was a $250 million investment. The Americans offered 12 million. Oh, it's not going to happen, is it? So China, without any coercion or bullying, went in, invested in mining, invested in resources. So it made itself significant to Greenland/Denmark. Then it watched the situation in the Arctic as the ice began to break up, and it could see coming to everybody, there was going to be new trade routes and all the dynamics politically that come with that. So it calls itself, I think it's an Arctic associated country with an interest. So rather than do anything, it knew that Trump had his eyes on Greenland in his first term, and it was a strange bugbear of his. So it's allowing America and Europe to be in conflict now, saying nothing. Russia's staying out of the way too. So the two forces arraigned against it, led by Washington, Brussels and Washington, are now weakening each other through this conflict. That's good for China and it's good for Russia. So often China doesn't have to do anything because it is actually looking at the political trend. A lot of countries are going to be thinking, we need to deal more, of course, with, as I said earlier, with India, because we don't want to be too focused on the Chinese market. But in this situation, China is going to find itself far more focused on what real relationships it has. China has an agreement for mutual self-defense with North Korea. That's it. China is not obliged to follow North Korea on any military adventure. China has a very bad relationship with North Korea. I've been to North Korea. I've heard their side of the story, and they distrust China. They don't like the Chinese. China is often beside itself when it looks at the missile tests and the military adventurism of Kim Jong-un. So China's got a lot of conflict to consider. It's got Russia to its west and north. And if you take what China has lost to Russia over its history, you take the Mississippi River in the US, the equivalent of everything to the coast of California, that's the amount taken, whether it's chunks of Xinjiang, taking Mongolia, or that strip of coastline where Vladivostok is, which was once China's exposure to the Western Pacific. China's lost more to Russia than any other colonial power. Does it trust Russia? No. It's drawn Russia close so it can keep an eye on Russia and manage its relationship. India is very important for China in this new multipolar world. It needs to have a strong relationship with it. Otherwise, it is going to be dealing with too many fractured, difficult relationships. Its relationship with the European Union is a very difficult one. Its relationship with Australia is actually politically a difficult one. Its relationships in Latin America if you look at the patchwork of distrust, dissent, benefit, trade, commitment, betrayal, there's a tremendous instability in terms of these political relationships for China. It's doing its best. Resolve one with India. You take out of this potentially rather volatile multipolar mix a major piece. So it has a political motive to work with India. And India needs to think, regardless of the weaknesses you've identified, it is potentially able to work from strength, taking some of these things into consideration.
So let's assume China sets out to achieve all that you have described. In which cities in India, in which circles in India does China have influence?
I would say in Mumbai there are relationships. I think in the financial world, money is pretty agnostic. So I think there's quite a lot of there are quite a few relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of that, you mentioned the Indian military, and I think they're
probably
from an intellectual.
Chennai is Tamil Nadu is the manufacturing state of India, probably, and it's on the eastern side, so probably it makes sense there.
It would make sense. I don't know the answer in detail to the question, but I think wherever there is manufacturing, there would be trade because India, as you said, buys so much from China. And where China looks at potential future relationships, existing industrial bases are a pretty good way of doing it. But let's remember that we now live in an age of smart manufacturing and robotics. And we could drive 2 hours from where I am sitting now and enter a bunch of factories where there are no human beings, almost. There's a bunch of blokes in a room full of screens in a glass box overlooking a totally automated system. So, whether it's sorting apples or building cars. So that's the kind of technology potentially that China could bring to India, which has its issues, because one of the things that is critically useful is, of course, a new industrial relationship should mean employment. So that's something where India has to think very carefully. Are we going to benefit in terms of smart technology and robotics and AI in India from dealing with China? Or are we going to give a market to China where those tools, which are Chinese, are going to be utilized and we won't get the employment benefits that we want from the relationship?
Got it. So let's talk about something different. China is buying precious metals, and this has driven up their prices. What effect will this have on the rupee and on India?
The current trend, it won't be positive. We need, it's because it's geopolitical tensions that have made rare earths, for instance, so expensive. So in the short term, I don't see any way out of this.
I'm not talking about rare earths. I'm talking of precious metals like gold, silver, platinum, palladium.
Excuse me. Precious metals, yes. That's a problem. China is arguably at the second largest gold reserve in the world now, and it's the refuge of any economy which has well-founded concerns over the stability and value of currencies. So yeah, China's going to continue to do that, and that's not good for India. As long as China needs to do it, we need a shift. I don't see that coming soon because the US dollar is related, and the dollar itself is simply a reflection of American global power and the integrity of the American economy. And while the American economy is actually fundamentally strong, the current situation that we are seeing in the United States in volatility means that if you can store and hoard gold and silver, you do, and China will continue to.
Let me shift the conversation to BRICS. One of my editors, in fact, my chief strategy officer, Peter Isaacson, goes on about BRICS. So it would be remiss of me not to mention BRICS. Does that have any role to play in fostering a better trade relationship between China and India, or is BRICS more of a talking shop, which doesn't count for much?
Well, it was. It's no longer. Remember, BRICS was a smart-assed idea of an US or a British investment banker on a late after, I think after a long lunch.
Yeah.
That's right. But it's becoming something with more substance.
Yeah.
I applaud India from not participating in the naval exercises being soon to be conducted by BRICS nations, because BRICS is not a military alliance. BRICS is not an alliance in any geopolitical sense. BRICS is immensely useful because it's based on very quantifiable economic self-interest of member nations. And it's also a bit like, in some ways, what the non-aligned movement was once upon a time. When you are outside the US dollar and euro sphere, and those nations are bullying you constantly, it pushes you together. You may not be natural allies or friends, but you unify because of the schoolyard bully, and that's what BRICS, from an economic perspective, has as a force, and is continuing to be of greater use to itself and member countries. And if we look at it, BRICS is in an interesting situation. 30 countries want to join. The rest of the world is clamoring to enter BRICS as the Western system, the post-Second World War system, is beginning to break down. So absolutely, it's a good place. And it's very useful for two powerful countries like India and China to have a conversation in what is a varied and a forum with a multiplicity of nations with interests and issues and relationships. So it's quite a good platform. It's not just the usual bilateral discussions. It's done in a context of other varied friends and trade partners. So I think BRICS is going to gain more and more traction. I also think it will benefit China, and that more of these countries will be settling transactions in renminbi, because the renminbi, while not convertible, is a reliably managed currency. And so it's probably less expensive from a political perspective than dealing in the US dollar. What I would like to see, I don't want BRICS to develop a currency. They can't make the mistake Europe made, which is try and develop an instrument that is definitive in terms of value within an economic coalition that has none of the underlying roots that a currency needs. So you can't put a stretch cling wrap, I think you call it, or cling foil, or something, glad wrap across an economy and hope that will keep it fresh. The euro was a failure, in my view, in many areas because it impoverished Portugal in crisis, Greece in crisis. So avoid the currency. But there can be an interlocking system of working currencies that are not the US dollar, that are the BRICS. So India is in a strong position. The fact it's not participating in the military exercise is a very good move by India.
Let's talk about Russia, because both China and India consume a lot of Russian energy. Once upon a time, the Soviet Union was the model for both communist China and socialist India. And even today, Russia matters for both countries. India gets a lot of military technology and military kit from Russia. And China, of course, is maintaining a close relationship with Russia, if simply to keep an eye on it. What role will Russia play in a potential China-India economic relationship? Let's assume, for instance, that India wilts under US pressure and stops buying Russian energy, at least in the same quantities as before, and China steps up its purchases. Does that mean that Russia will increasingly skew more towards China, or do you think China could redirect some of the Russian purchases to India? What is the future between the three of them? or among the
I,
three?
d- I don't know. It's a very hard one to call. If I was Putin, I would worry about the warming relationships between India and China. Because in a sense, his independent relationship with both was part of Moscow's strength. As Delhi and Beijing have fewer conflicts, then Russia is less singularly important to both. So certainly, I mean, Modi is soon to face an election, and given his age and the way your democracy works, it's probable that there'll be somebody else running India, whoever that might be, and their relationship with, for a while, Xi Jinping.
It's certainly sunset time for Narendra Modi. So he's certainly on his way out. He's not going tomorrow, but he's not here for long.
But I think long enough that whatever is re-established between China and India is going to be an interesting factor in what is currently this triad of the three, including Russia. I think that, again, though, there are the external pressures on the three. That means they're more likely to have to work together. And I think to that degree, Russia's role is positive because Russia and India do have a good relationship. They understand each other well. They don't interfere in each other's domestic policy or their border issues. So that's a rational trend. I'd say transactional relationship, but even when I was in Delhi, one of my meetings, someone said, my son is currently in Moscow. And the relationship's very close. But it's not as close with China, but it's improved hugely. Mm-hmm. And the Chinese economy is something that both India and Russia, when they think of what leverage China has over them, regardless of what they're suffering with the US, the potential is China has leverage. So in a sense, I think a three-way relationship based on shared political injury, a sense of injustice. There is something that Delhi, Moscow, and Beijing can work together on, and they can work to support each other in, because that external pressure is not going to weaken. Washington is not going to suddenly change. We saw what an alternative to Donald Trump was, a Democratic administration, whether it's under Biden or someone younger and more aware and more cognizant, will still be anti-China. So they have a geopolitical interest, and I think it will continue to deepen. The thing is to balance the commercial interests. Again, China could overwhelm the Russian economy, and there's currently a large dependence on China. But it's not just dumping products into Russia. It's measuring the fact that it needs to have some kind of balance and restraint because it needs to be a friend with Russia. So let's look at it from a geopolitical perspective with India. The same thing means it needs the government to be a bit, to talk to the companies to make sure it governs any Belt and Road project. So it is to India's benefit because of their political interest.
Final question. What are the best, worst, and most likely scenarios for the China-India economic relationship? Look into your crystal ball, gaze into your crystal ball, and act the sage.
Regardless of the qualities and caveats we have identified in both countries, and regardless of the myth, in a way, of their historical prowess in terms of global GDP, there are two things. One is that both India and China are very practical nations. India has a greater emotional part, and that is certainly evident in its religions and philosophies. But there is great pragmatism in Indian business. There is great pragmatism in Indian invention, Indian ingenuity in industrial things. So I think both countries have the potential to meet as pragmatists and to be beneficially transactional, allow companies to do business, allow exchanges to be based on real benefits to both parties without worrying too much about the greater political relationship. And I think that'll be what leads this. So that I forecast, and I think that is a strength. The weakness is the nationalism of both countries. The weakness in China is that nationalism is well built in to its identity. The identity of victimhood, its relationship with Japan, and China has every reason to look at Japan and to be cautious because of the history. The behavior of Japan throughout Asia in the Second World War was monstrous, but the worst place was in China. So they can't forget, but they have to stop identifying themselves today with the injuries of the past and realize they now work from strength. So that sense of injustice, it's changing a lot, but it's still there in Chinese DNA. And
may I quickly interject? I do meet some Chinese from time to time who point out that it was Indian troops that burnt the Summer Palace in Beijing under Lord Elgin II. I meet Chinese thinkers who point out that it was Indian policemen who carried out much oppression in places like Hong Kong, often Sikh. And so there is a sense of resentment against India for being lackeys to the British and providing the manpower that acted as an instrument of oppression. Chinese often will say that we just hope you don't repeat what you did with the British, this time with the Americans. So there is this suspicion that India could move to the US side and India could be the big knight or rook or whatever piece you want to call it on the geopolitical chessboard against China. That suspicion comes up to the fore every now and then in conversations with the Chinese, or some of the Chinese, I should specify.
And if I may say, in their enunciation, it's facile. It's so minor in the scheme of things. I've never heard it before. I'm well aware of how Shanghai was policed. I'm well aware of the British use colonially of Indian troops. But most Chinese I know don't see that as India. They see that as colonial Britain. And they don't see those Indians in person as doing anything from the Indian culture. That's just imperialism. So I would entreat you to dismiss it. Nonetheless, the Chinese do fear India. The Chinese do look at India as being a threat. And the government has utilized the border tensions for internal nationalistic use to galvanize people that here we're involved in a military fracas, which we always come out on top because it's reported as such, although we know how many Indians died recently, we don't know how many Chinese. So that has been utilized. At that
point, 2020 was a historical blunder in my view, because things were going swimmingly well for the Chinese in the Indian market. They were exporting goods. They had their apps operating all across India. They had investments in lucrative companies in India. So I never understood what they gained from 2020. I still don't.
I have a theory, and look, please take this with a grain of salt because it's only a theory. But when I'm in the west of China in Xinjiang province, which we discussed in the last podcast, there is an interest in security services on the border to always get resources as much as they can. If there is a problem, then they have greater cause. It's like one's own security services, the spooks in one's own country. As long as they can peddle theories of danger and national threat to their parliaments, they have jobs, whereas a lot of it is just imaginary. It's possible that something that was thought to be minor got out of hand in a kind of move for getting more resources in that particular area for those people running that part of the military is a possibility. I don't think, however, that Beijing for any moment had any strategic purpose in this. I can't see how Beijing saw it to its own advantage. So to me, a blunder, a mistake, I don't know the causes. But when anything does happen, it triggers this deep sense of resentment, this deep sense of injury amongst Chinese people for all the colonial histories that they've, all the colonial history that they've suffered. So in a way, it's overly weighted in the Chinese mind because of what it relates to. It's very important, therefore, that the current disciplines are maintained. And look, you have two very well-structured, well-governed militaries, by and large, and they should be able to do this. So in worst-case scenario, which you said, was one of my thoughts. In a weaker administration, and let's not assume that everything in Beijing is going to be hunky-dory for the next 5 to 10 years. There'll be periods when there'll be weaknesses, when there's the transition from Xi Jinping because he is getting older,
There's
like
no
Modi.
spring chicken either, who's like Modi,
Right.
getting older, and who's
And
at some point
someone comes into,
someone younger will come in.
and perhaps that person doesn't have the same power base, and so they do things to try and augment it. Look at Takeuchi in Japan and her statement about Taiwan. That was because domestically she was weak and she tried to galvanize a domestic constituency. That could happen here. It could relate to what we know as the potential increased conflict with India. But I don't think that's in the mind of the Chinese. I think the other area which is possible is that while I talked about an incremental relationship economically in terms of the two countries getting together again, it could be that it's haphazard and it's kind of ad hoc. And in that situation, some bad things can happen. Maybe a Chinese factory isn't well run, or there's some industrial accident that is, from a Chinese investment, or there are a corruption scandal that Chinese investors involved in, things that really damage the perception of Indians towards China or vice versa. These are all the perils that we face going forward down this path. And most of those are in some form going to manifest because we've seen them in the very recent history. Nonetheless, let's remind ourselves what drives nations: self-interest and need, and what works within nations: self-interest and human need. And in both countries, those needs are considerable. They are still considerable here. So that's the thing that I go back to. And you can take a view, maybe it is, again, Nehruvian view of history, which would refer more to Marx, but that what we experience in the present comes from deep rhythms, generations before ourselves, that are now manifesting from history. I think there is truth in that. I think we can change the direction of these things as you can move the tiller, as you guide a craft down a fast-flowing river. So human agency is not out of that picture. But I think the forces of history and economics and geopolitics are positive in terms of both countries need each other more than they need to be in conflict with each other.
On that positive note, David Mahon, thank you for your time. Thank you for speaking to us on a very busy day in Shanghai. We will see you again very soon.
Thank you, Atul.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.